A single white spotlight cuts through the darkness of a stadium and finds Michael Jackson frozen in his smooth criminal lean, hat brim low, fingers splayed like talons. 4 or 5 breath-held seconds, the world forgets everything except the wonder of that impossible angle. Then the illusion snaps. The crowd erupts, and 35 million television sets in living rooms from Tokyo to Toledo spill applause across their carpets. What no one in the arena can hear is the sound coming from another continent, the steady thunder of Fleet Street printing presses, turning midnight into morning. The Sun, the Daily Mirror, the news of the world, each title competes to slam the biggest, loudest headline on its front page. Before Jackson's limousine reaches his hotel, London kiosks are already stacking papers that bark the same 3 branded words: Wacko Jacka returns. The man who just stopped time with choreography is reduced to a punchline selling tomorrow's bacon wrap and bus ride. The nickname first surfaced in 1984, a half-throwaway in The People. But editors noticed something extraordinary. Sales spiked whenever the words Jackson and Wacko shared ink. They fused the rhyme, put it in caps, and discovered gold. By the late 80s, Fleet Street had fashioned a simple algebra that would define the next 3 decades of Jackson's life. Any cover featuring his name guaranteed roughly 200,000 extra copies at breakfast. If facts were scarce, imagination filled the gap. Oxygen tents, pet chimpanzees, bizarre surgeries, hyperbaric sleep chambers. The more outrageous the claim, the faster the papers vanished from news. Sensationalism, eat, turn it out, was an algorithm long before Silicon Valley coined the term. Across the Atlantic, American cable television, freshly deregulated, flush with advertising dollars, suddenly obliged to program 24 hours a day needed content to pad the endless reel. Jackson provided perfect raw material, recognizable in every time zone, private enough to invite conjecture, eccentric enough to turn conjecture into spectacle. A single paparazzi photo could generate a 3-segment panel debate on CNN, spawn jokes on Jay Leno, and loop as B-roll on hard copy until the next rumor surfaced. The economics were brutal on nights featuring a Jackson story. Primetime ratings jumped 40%, and advertisers paid accordingly. Network executives began to pray for a new Wacko angle before the 5-P.M. Rundown. This is the story of how tabloid culture weaponized eccentricity, how headlines became identity, and how a man built to illuminate stages became trapped in the relentless machinery of scandal. This is the tabloid war. Rumor followed a predictable assembly line in those pre-internet days, a circuit that would repeat thousands of times over decades. A breathless whisper in a British tabloid, Jackson considering face transplant surgery, would cross the wire services and land in an American newsroom, as sources say, then slide into a late-night monologue as unquestioned fact. Each outlet pointed to the last as confirmation. None paused long enough to verify the origin. By the time the story finished its circuit through papers, cable news, and television comedy, the fiction had solidified into folklore. Casual readers believed it because they'd heard it everywhere. Everyone heard it everywhere because the first outlet had printed it. The machine was self-perpetuating, and Michael Jackson was its fuel. These headlines did more than sell copies. They rewired the man they targeted from the inside out. Watch early footage of Jackson, a 12-year-old, in bright polyester belting "I Want You Back" with an open, toothy grin, unself-conscious and luminous. Fast forward to the bad era in 1988. The smile remains but never quite reaches his eyes anymore, and every public movement looks choreographed for maximum distance from the crowd. Friends who knew him well would later recall that he began reading British papers obsessively while on tour, circling insults in red pen, asking in genuine disbelief whether the public truly thought him a freak. He had vitiligo, an autoimmune disease that bleaches the skin in irregular patches. But tabloids reframed the condition as something far more sinister: race denial, self-hatred, a man trying to escape his own skin. Every new depigmented spot became another headline, another proof that Jackson was turning himself white. After a second rhinoplasty to address breathing difficulties, gossip pages called him a self-hating monster at war with his own face, when he donned a surgical mask to protect his throat while touring polluted cities. Cameras snapped the image and ran it as evidence of derangement rather than medical necessity. Jackson's increasingly elaborate disguises, masks, scarves, umbrellas, tunnels connecting hotels to concert venues were rational measures against stalking lenses and genuine threats to his safety, yet each added layer of armor was interpreted by commentators as further confirmation of madness, of the wacko label finally proving itself. The cycle had become self-reinforcing. Harassment produced withdrawal. Withdrawal looked suspicious. Suspicion licensed harsher harassment. There was no way to win. No way to answer the accusations without validating them. No path back to normalcy once the machinery had fixed you as its central narrative. Jackson tried to perform his way out of it, creating increasingly elaborate stage shows and music videos that cost millions. He bought Neverland Ranch and attempted to build a world sealed off from the tabloid machinery. He gave fewer interviews, granted fewer photographs, spoke mainly through his art. None of it mattered. The less he said, the more people invented. The more he retreated, the more certain everyone became that he had something to hide. The tabloids had created a trap with no exit, and by the early 90s it had begun to close around him completely. In 1993, the machinery shifted into a far darker gear when the first allegations of child molestation surfaced, and the narrative darkened irreversibly from tabloid curiosity into something resembling criminal certainty. Where Wacko once suggested harmless eccentricity, the glove, the mask, the pet chimpet, now shaded into predation, into danger, into a threat that justified any invasion, any rumor, any accusation printed without verification. Jackson settled the civil suit that year to avoid a public trial, a decision that seemed pragmatic at the time, but was instantly transmuted by tabloids into confession. Settlement became guilt. Privacy became cover. His own attorney's advice to avoid the court system became evidence that the court system would have convicted him. The public read the settlement as tacit admission of crimes he had not been charged with, much less tried for. When another family brought charges a decade later, news organizations seemed to abandon even the pretense of journalistic caution. Commentators who had never met Jackson, never interviewed him, never investigated the claims, independently declared guilt as if it were meteorological fact. During jury selection for the 2005 Santa Barbara trial, nearly 8 citizens in town admitted they had already formed an opinion from media coverage. Most believed he was guilty before the trial even began. Cameras ringed the courthouse like artillery. Commentators dissected his outfits, his posture, the way he clasped his children as hands. Every gesture became an exhibit in the prosecution of character, rather than a neutral observation. The trial lasted for months. Jackson's legal team presented evidence of inconsistencies in accusers' stories, contradictory testimony, and a pattern of financial incentive. The defense was methodical, credible, and increasingly confident as the trial progressed. Yet the media narrative never shifted. On news broadcasts, Jackson's appearance was always described as bizarre. His legal team's arguments were desperate. His character witnesses were paid loyalists. The machinery had already decided the verdict long before the jury was sworn in. When the jury finally deliberated and acquitted him on every count, not guilty on child abuse, not guilty on conspiracy, not guilty across the board, the courtroom erupted. Justice, in its technical form, had spoken, but the verdict earned a fraction of the airtime lavished on the accusations and trial coverage. Redemption, it turned out, was poor box office compared to scandal. Doubt thrilled audiences. Certainty bored them. Papers that had screamed pervert Jacques on trial in letters 3 inches tall buried not guilty beside lottery numbers and weather forecasts the next morning. Cable pundits shifted seamlessly from conviction narrative to reasonable doubt commentary without acknowledging the pivot. Why the jury got it wrong. One headline proclaimed, "Unanswered questions." Another suggested, could it happen again? Even in exoneration, Jackson was guilty. The machinery had simply recalibrated its mechanism of proof. For Jackson, the legal victory felt hollow and incomplete, like winning a battle after losing the war. Legal exoneration could not compete with 2 decades of narrative entrenchment, with the sheer tonnage of ink and airtime that had branded him as predatory. The word wacko had calcified into something harder. Darkano. Longer acute eccentricity, but an indictment. He began to withdraw from public life, not out of guilt, but out of a rational recognition that the machinery was designed to punish him regardless of verdict. He decamped to Bahrain, then Ireland, then back to Los Angeles. But always at a remove, floating between rented estates and borrowed castles, composing songs no label dared to release. Journalists called the exile self-inflicted, as if isolation were a character flaw rather than a logical response to being hunted. They covered his reliance on prescription sedatives, not as a medical crisis born of decades of trauma, but as proof of moral decay, another confirmation that the tabloids had been right all along. Every attempt at a comeback charity singles, Beverly Hills meetings, the ill-fated This Is It tour rehearsals was framed not as artistic ambition, but as desperation, as a washed-up performer grasping at fading glory. Jackson had fallen into an echo chamber, whose walls he could neither breach nor ignore. Each headline bounced back, amplified, stripping him of the very credibility he needed to answer it. To speak was to give the machinery fresh fuel. To stay silent was to let the narrative continue unchallenged. There was no third option. His former allies began to distance themselves. Studio executives avoided him. Radio stations dropped his music from rotation. The merchandise dried up. By the 2000s, Michael Jackson was becoming untouchable in the most literal sense, a man whose name carried such accumulated baggage that association alone could damage a career. He aged rapidly during this period, photographs showing a face that seemed to hollow from within. Friends who visited described a man who had retreated so far into protective mechanisms that reaching him required traveling through corridors of lawyers, doctors, and security. The Wako Jaka of tabloid imagination had eaten through to the man underneath, had colonized his body and his choices, had transformed genuine eccentricity into something closer to catatonia. He was still composing, still visioning music videos and concert spectacles, but always at a remove, always filtered through layers of protection that nobody was permitted to penetrate. The machinery had succeeded not in proving him guilty, but in making guilt the only narrative shape that fit his life anymore. When news of his cardiac arrest broke on June 25, 2009, the world's internet infrastructure nearly collapsed under the weight of traffic surges. Within minutes Wako Jaka dead trended worldwide shorthand, persisting even in the moment of death as if the boy who sang healed the world had been only a sideshow curiosity from the start, not one of the greatest entertainers who ever lived. Some outlets appended shocked emojis. Others recycled archived photos of surgical masks and chimpanzees, as if the cause of death were inherent to his strangeness rather than a cocktail of prescribed medications that had been slowly eroding his physiology for years. Even in death, the pejorative remained unchanged, unquestioned. Yet something shifted in the days that followed, a cultural pause that nobody had anticipated. Fans camped outside the Apollo Theater by the thousands, playing Man in the Mirror on portable speakers and crying openly in ways they had permitted themselves to cry while he was alive. Columnists who once mocked his eccentricities published uneasy confessions about complicity and regret. Documentary filmmakers began re-examining footage they'd archived, noticing for the first time the pain behind the mask, the isolation within the spectacle. A few journalists asked the question nobody wanted to answer, with a relentless ridicule, accumulated over 3 decades without mercy or pause, had accelerated his dependence on anesthetics, strong enough to silence nightmares, but risky enough to still a heart. The question hung in the air for perhaps 2 weeks. Then the machinery resumed its normal function. By the next news cycle, tabloids returned to their comfort zone, speculating about hidden paternity, secret wills, fresh abuse allegations that seemed to multiply now that the man could no longer defend himself. The digital era guaranteed that no scandal ever truly died. Each could be resurrected with a click, generating new ads, new outrage, new profit margins. Waco Jaka remained a searchable tag instantly accessible to anyone reading about Jackson for the first time. Forever framed within the pejorative that had sold so many breakfast tabloids in 19... His catalog was streamed billions of times by people encountering his music, divorced from tabloid context. Yet those same people, as Google search for Michael Jackson would populate with headlines from decades past, reanimated corpses of scandal. The digital archive had created a permanent prison where past and present existed simultaneously. His death, rather than providing closure, had simply shifted the narrative from what is he doing now to what did he really do. There was no redemption available in the digital age, only endless recirculation of the worst interpretations of his life, compressed into hashtags and trending topics that would spike every time a documentary premiered, every time a new allegation surfaced, every time a new generation encountered his name through the filter of tabloid history rather than artistic achievement. Michael Jackson's story, stripped of tabloid noise and reduced to its essence, is achingly ordinary. A gifted child pressed into adult labor by a driven father. A sensitive artist, bewildered by fame's distortions. A man who spent fortunes chasing the privacy that most people guard without effort or expense. What renders the tale extraordinary? What makes it a cautionary chronicle worth examining is the sheer scale of the machinery that consumed him. The mirror held up to Jackson was not made of glass, but of newsprint, cathode rays, and later, HTML code surfaces that reflected only the angles that paid dividends. Every headline, every laugh-track punchline from late-night comedians, every paparazzi bob, every internet rumor was another shard added to the mosaic until the mosaic replaced the man entirely. We like to believe that, after tragedy comes learning, that societies absorb catastrophe and reform themselves to prevent recurrence. Yet the machinery that devoured Jackson proceeded to devour others in quick succession. Princess Diana fleeing paparazzi into a tunnel. Britney Spears, confined to conservatorship, partially enabled by tabloid-generated public opinion. Amy Winehouse suffering as tabloids predicted her death with almost gleeful certainty. Each iteration refining the technique, never pausing to mourn the last casualty before moving to the next. The equation remained unchanged even as the medium migrated from paper to screen to phone. Sensationalism sells, nuance costs money. The profit margin on rumor is infinite and guilt requires no evidence when headlines can substitute for proof. Jackson, who once moonwalked into history as the most celebrated entertainer alive, now serves as a footnote on the collateral damage of unlimited appetite. A case study in how a society can systematically destroy something beautiful while calling it journalism. The man who transformed popular music, who broke down racial barriers through MTV, who created music videos that became art form unto themselves. He is remembered by billions through the distorting lens of tabloid reduction. Imagine returning to that opening spotlight in the stadium, the moment before the lean, the second before the crowd erupts. Freeze the frame and listen beneath the roar. You can almost hear the distant presses warming up, the satellite trucks idling outside studio doors, the keyboards ready to tweet the moment the performance ends and the story begins. The war is already cued. Always keyword waiting for the show to finish, so the real work of destruction can commence. Somewhere inside that lone figure on stage mask, fedora, sequined glove, the weight of the future is already settling. Heavy as armor, sharp as glass, impossible to remove. The spotlight will fade. The crowd will disperse. The papers will come. And another human being will learn that excellence and eccentricity are the only credentials necessary to become tabloid. Pray that in a world where sensation sells, the most dangerous thing you can be is talented and strange.